The Great Hall of the Galactic Convergence Council was not built for human eyes. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed near the top. The walls were made of a crystal material that changed color every few seconds: deep blue, then green, then a color that had no name in any human language. Thousands of aliens sat in curved rows, all of them watching the same thing. A small blue and white planet, rotating slowly on a holographic display in the center of the hall. Earth. The planet had been the talk of the galaxy for 6 months. A new species had broken the light-speed barrier. That alone was enough to get attention. Only 19 species in all of recorded galactic history had ever managed it. Most of them had gone on to become powerful members of the Council. A few had caused wars. One had destroyed itself within 50 years of the discovery. Everyone wanted to know which kind were the humans. Ambassador Kael'thar of the Volkai Empire stood near the front of the room. He was tall, close to 3 meters, with dark green scales that shimmered under the hall's light. His species had ruled a large section of the galaxy for 2,000 years. They were known for 2 things: their military strength and their pride. Kael'thar had both in great supply. He looked at the holographic data panel floating beside Earth's image. He read the numbers. He read them again. Then he made a sound that, in his language, was the equivalent of a laugh. "Class 3 prey world," he said to the aide standing next to him. "No body armor, no venom, no enhanced senses. Their bones break easily. Their skin tears at almost nothing. Average body temperature so high they burn energy just standing still." He shook his large head slowly. "And they built a ship fast enough to reach us." His aide, a younger Volkai with lighter scales, looked at the data too. Remarkable engineering for a prey species. "That is all it is," Kael'thar said. "Engineering. A bird can build a nest. That does not make it a predator." On the other side of the hall, the human delegation had just arrived. There were 5 of them. They wore simple dark uniforms with a small Earth flag stitched on the left shoulder. They looked around the hall with wide eyes, not frightened eyes, but curious ones. The kind of eyes that wanted to understand everything they were seeing and file it away for later use. At the front of the group walked Dr. Mara Voss. She was a small woman by most standards, just under average human height, lean, with short dark hair and brown skin. She carried no visible weapon. She wore no armor. She moved through the enormous alien hall the way someone might walk through a crowded market, aware of everything, bothered by nothing. The council's welcome ceremony was long. Different species gave speeches in different languages. A translation device in each delegate's ear handled most of it, though sometimes the device paused for a few seconds, confused by something that had no direct translation. When it was Kael'thar's turn to speak, he stepped forward and addressed the human delegation directly. "We of the Volkai Empire welcome the humans of Earth to the Galactic Convergence," he said. His voice was deep, almost like thunder in the large hall. "We have reviewed your biological profile, and we understand the challenges your species must face in a galaxy such as this one." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land clearly. "We would like to offer Earth the formal protection status of the Volkai Empire. This designation is reserved for worlds whose people are vulnerable to the dangers of open space. You will travel under our flag. No one will harm you." A quiet murmur moved through the hall. Protection status. That was what the Volkai offered to small farming worlds that couldn't defend themselves. It was a polite word for something that wasn't polite at all. Mara Voss stepped forward. She looked up at Kael'thar. He was nearly twice her height, and she smiled. It was a calm, easy smile, the kind a person gives when they already know something the other person doesn't. "We are very grateful for the kind offer," she said, "and we accept it in the spirit in which it was given." Kael'thar looked satisfied. Around the hall, other species relaxed. The humans had accepted their place. Good, that made things simple. The ceremony continued. There were more speeches, a formal meal involving foods from dozens of worlds, and long conversations between delegates about trade and territory. The humans moved through all of it politely. They asked questions. They listened carefully. They smiled often. No one paid them much attention after the first hour. That was a mistake. Later that evening, when most of the delegates had moved to the open corridors outside the main hall for informal conversation, a young Volcae diplomat named Severin was walking alone near the east wing when he saw something that made him stop. Dr. Voss was standing alone at the end of a long corridor. The corridor had a wide observation window that looked out into space, but she wasn't looking at the stars. She was looking at a holographic display she had pulled up from a small device on her wrist. Severin recognized the display immediately. It was a star map, but not a trade route map or a tourist chart. It was a military intelligence map, the kind that showed the home systems of every major species in the galaxy with notes attached to each one. Population numbers, fleet sizes, known battle history. He walked a little closer, quietly, curious. He could see her eyes moving across the map with focused attention. Her finger hovered over each species marker for only a second before moving to the next. She wasn't reading. She was memorizing. Severin felt a strange feeling he couldn't quite name, something between confusion and discomfort. He told himself she was studying threats. She was a small, weak creature far from home in a dangerous galaxy. Of course she was looking at who might hurt her. That made sense. That was what prey did. They learned where the predators were so they could avoid them. He almost walked away. But then he noticed something that made him stay. She wasn't looking at the most powerful species and moving on. She wasn't checking the Volcae or the Thraxi or the Drain and then closing the map in fear. She was looking at each species the way a general looks at a map before a campaign. She was noting their weaknesses, their cluster points, the gaps between their patrol routes. She wasn't making a list of things to run from. She was making a list of things to understand, to measure, to plan around. Severin stood very still. Mara Voss closed her display without looking up. She spoke without turning around. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was pleasant. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" Severin said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, it is." She finally turned and looked at him. Her eyes were calm and dark and steady. "Don't worry," she said. "We're just getting familiar with the neighborhood." She smiled again, that same quiet, easy smile, and walked away down the corridor, her footsteps soft and even. Severin stood at the window for a long time after she was gone. He looked out at the stars. He thought about what he had seen. Then he went to file a report. Professor Zyrevan had spent 40 years studying biology. She had cataloged over 300 species in her career. She had written papers that were read across 11 star systems. She had won the Elhari Grand Science Prize twice. She was not a person who frightened easily, and she was certainly not the kind of scientist who panicked over data. But the file sitting open on her desk was making her very uncomfortable. It had started as routine work. After every first contact event, the Galactic Biology Institute received a full biological profile of the new species and was asked to complete a formal classification report. The Council needed it for their records. It usually took a week. It was usually boring. Zyrevan had opened the human file on a quiet morning with a cup of warm leaf water and no particular expectations. That had been 3 days ago. She hadn't left her office since. She reached out with one of her 6 slender arms and pulled the primary data panel closer. The numbers and charts were all still there, still saying the same impossible things they had been saying since she first looked at them. She started from the beginning again, the way she always did when something didn't make sense. The humans were, on the surface, remarkably ordinary, medium-sized mammals, warm-blooded, bipedal, average lifespan of around 80 years without medical enhancement, no natural armor, No claws worth mentioning. No venom. Poor hearing compared to most species. A sense of smell so weak it was almost non-functional by galactic standards. Vision that couldn't see in the dark at all. On paper they looked like prey. Simple, soft, slow prey. But then came the things that didn't fit. The first thing Zyrevan had noticed was the eyes. She had a rule she had developed over 4 decades of biology work, a rule so reliable it had never once failed her across 300 species. Predators have forward-facing eyes. Prey have eyes on the sides of their head. It was simple geometry. Predators need depth perception to judge distance when attacking. Prey need wide-angle vision to spot threats coming from any direction. Human eyes faced directly forward. That was not a prey feature. That was a hunter's feature. The kind of eyes evolution builds when a creature needs to lock onto a target and close the distance accurately. She had noted it, moved on, and told herself it was probably an evolutionary leftover. It happened sometimes. She had moved to the next section. The skeletal structure. Human bones were not particularly strong. They broke under pressure that many species could handle easily. But the shape of those bones told a very old story. The hip structure, the angle of the legs, the length of the tendons, it all pointed to one thing: long-distance movement. Not fast movement, not powerful movement, but sustained movement over very long periods of time. Zyrevan had pulled up the locomotion data. Humans couldn't run faster than most large animals on their planet, but they could run or walk for an extraordinarily long time without stopping. Their cooling system was bizarre. Instead of panting like most warm-blooded creatures, they sweated. Liquid poured from their skin, evaporating and dropping their body temperature continuously. She had cross-referenced this with the fossil record. The conclusion had made her put down her leaf water and stare at the wall. Humans had used this ability to hunt, not to ambush prey, not to run prey down in a sprint. They had tracked animals sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day at a slow, steady pace, following them across open ground under a hot sun. The prey animal would eventually overheat because it could only cool itself by panting, and panting required stopping. The humans never needed to stop. They just kept walking, kept following, kept closing the distance, slowly and patiently, until the animal simply fell over from heat exhaustion. It was called persistence hunting, and it had been one of humanity's primary survival methods for hundreds of thousands of years. Zyrevan sat with that for a long time. A creature that couldn't outrun its prey, that couldn't overpower it, that had no natural weapons to kill it quickly, but that could simply follow it without rest, without giving up, until the prey had nothing left. She moved to the chemical data. Humans produced a compound called adrenaline. Most species produced something similar, a stress response chemical that triggered the fight-or-flight reaction. In most species, adrenaline pushed toward flight, get away, escape, survive. In humans, adrenaline did something different. It suppressed pain. It increased aggression. It narrowed focus to the immediate threat and pushed the body toward confrontation. When a human was in real danger, their chemistry actively encouraged them to fight back rather than run. She looked at the trauma response data next. Humans could sustain injuries that would incapacitate most species and continue functioning. Not because they felt less pain. The nerve data suggested they felt pain at roughly normal levels, but because something in their mental architecture allowed them to set it aside and keep moving when they believed the situation demanded it. She sat back in her chair. She was building a picture, and the picture was not of prey. Then she opened the fossil record. What she found there was what finally made her reach for the emergency classification panel. When humans had first evolved as a species, Earth had been full of large animals. Enormous animals, creatures that made humans look tiny. Massive herbivores with thick hides and heavy bones. Enormous predators with teeth the length of a human hand. Giant birds. Huge reptiles. Animals that had survived for millions of years before humans arrived. Within a relatively short period after modern humans spread across the planet, almost all of them were gone. Not from climate change, not from disease, from hunting. The humans had killed them, not because these animals had been easy targets. Many of them were far larger, far stronger, and far more dangerous than the humans who hunted them. But the humans had hunted them anyway, with simple tools, with persistence, with creativity and coordination. They had hunted the megafauna of their world so completely and so thoroughly that entire categories of large animal had simply ceased to exist. Zyrevan stared at the extinction data for a long time. She thought about what it meant, not just as a biological fact, but as a statement about what kind of creature humans were. They had not hunted these massive animals because they had to. Other food sources existed. They had hunted them because they were there, because it was a challenge, because something deep in human nature looked at a creature 20 times its size and didn't feel fear first. It felt something that looked, in the data, disturbingly like interest. She filed the report with the highest possible alarm classification. She attached every data file. She wrote a summary that was 3 times longer than any summary she had ever written before, because she needed the council to understand exactly what she was telling them. Humans were not prey. They had never been prey. Their entire biology was the product of an evolutionary history as active, aggressive hunters, creatures that had clawed their way to the top of one of the most competitive ecosystems in the known galaxy, not with natural weapons or physical superiority, but with endurance, intelligence, and a remarkable refusal to back down. She sent the report. The reply came back within hours. The message was short. Reclassify immediately. Humans are not prey. Zyrevan leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She stayed like that for a while, thinking about the small woman she had seen on the council hall recordings, the one who had accepted the Voakai protection offer with a calm smile, the one who had looked at a military star, mapped the way a general plans a war. The galaxy had offered humanity the role of the protected, the helpless, the small. And the humans had smiled and said thank you. Zyrevan was starting to understand why that smile was the most unsettling thing about them. She was still sitting there thinking when a second message arrived. This one was marked urgent. It came from the Council's Military Monitoring Division. A Voakai raid fleet had jumped into the Sol system 12 hours ago. They had gone in expecting to find a small, poorly defended world they could use to test its defenses, maybe take a few resources, establish dominance, the way they sometimes did with newly discovered Class 3 worlds before formal protections were in place. The fleet had not come back. Zyrevan read the message twice. Then she opened a new document and began to write the second part of her report. The emergency session of the Galactic Convergence Council was called before most delegates had even finished their morning routines. The message that went out was short and carried no extra details. It simply said, all delegates required, immediate attendance, Hall 1, no explanation, no agenda, just those 3 sentences and a time stamp. That alone was enough to scare people. The council had held maybe 4 emergency sessions in the last 100 years. Every one of them had ended with something changing permanently. When the delegates arrived, the holographic display at the center of the hall showed a star map. The Sol system, Earth's sun and its small family of planets, sitting quietly at the edge of a galactic arm. Around it, marked in red, were the last known positions of a Voakai raid fleet, 12 ships. The kind of fleet the Voakai used when they wanted to send a message to a new world, not large enough for a full invasion, but more than large enough to make any unprotected species comply. The red markers sat in a wide formation around the edge of Earth's solar system. And that was all, just markers, no fleet, no ships, no sign of where they had gone. Because they were gone. All 12 of them. The hall was loud for the first few minutes after the display went up. Different species spoke in different languages, all at once. Translators worked at full speed. The noise was like a storm building on the edge of a coast, that particular kind of sound that comes just before something very large makes contact with something that wasn't expecting it. Ambassador Kael'thar of the Volkai sat in his delegation's row with his large hands flat on the desk in front of him. His face was unreadable. In 40 years of political work, he had become very good at keeping his expression still when he needed to. But his aide, Severin, was sitting beside him, and Severin could see the tension in the way the ambassador's jaw was set, and the way his eyes hadn't moved from the red markers since the display went up. The fleet had been under Kael'thar's direct authorization. He had approved the mission personally. The council's chief speaker called the room to order. She was a tall, pale-skinned drain with 4 arms and a voice that carried easily over any noise. She laid out what was known. The fleet had entered Sol space on a reconnaissance and pressure mission, standard procedure for newly contacted worlds before formal treaties were signed. They had sent one burst transmission back to Volkai Command shortly after arrival. The transmission had said the approach was proceeding normally. After that, nothing. The fleet's emergency beacons, which activated automatically if a ship's hull was breached, had all triggered within a 4-hour window. Then the beacons had gone silent one by one, like lights being turned off in a room. 12 ships, around 1,800 crew total, gone. The chief speaker then pulled up the secondary data, fragments recovered from the edge of the system, by a passing automated survey drone that had been in the area by coincidence. It wasn't much. A few pieces of hull metal, one intact escape pod, empty and clean, with no signs of struggle inside, and a short-range communication recording, encrypted in Volkai military code, that had been drifting in space and had been decoded on the way to the session. It was a recording from the fleet's lead ship, sent in the last hour of the engagement. The voice on it was the fleet commander, a senior Volkai officer named Drathon. He had been calm in the recording, but his words were not calm things. He said, "They didn't fight the way any species fights. They used our own approach vector against us. They turned the debris field into a weapon. They knew our communication frequencies and jammed 3 of our ships simultaneously before we understood what was happening. They are everywhere and nowhere. We cannot establish a clear target. I have never seen anything like this." That was where the recording ended. The hall was very quiet after the chief speaker finished playing it. Then the Thraxi lead delegate, a large, multi-limbed creature named Veshkar, whose species was known for calculating everything carefully before speaking, said what most of the room was thinking. 12 ships, he said, with a crew of trained Volkai military personnel, destroyed by a species that has been in space for less than a decade. No one answered him, because there was no good answer. Then the human delegation's door opened, and Mara Voss walked in. She walked to the human delegation's assigned position with the same unhurried, even pace she always used. She sat down. She folded her hands on the desk. She looked at the red markers on the star map with an expression that was difficult to read, not pride, not anger, not satisfaction, something quieter than all of those things. The chief speaker looked at her. "Ambassador Voss, the council would welcome any statement from the human delegation regarding this incident." Mara Voss stood. She did not use notes. She spoke slowly and clearly, so the translators had no difficulty. "We did not start this," she said. "That needs to be on record. We did not invite that fleet into our system. We did not issue any threat. We asked for nothing except to be here at this table as equals." She paused. "When those ships entered our space, we gave them one warning. 1. We identified ourselves, stated that they were crossing into protected human territory, and asked them to stop and state their purpose. They did not respond. They accelerated toward our inner system." Another pause. Her voice stayed level throughout. "What happened after that was not an act of aggression. It was a response. We are a species that has been alive for 250,000 years. We have been fighting things bigger than us, faster than us, and stronger than us for most of that time. You are not the first predator to look at us and see something small and soft and assume that what you see is all that we are. She let that sit in the room for a moment. We don't want war. We are not here to conquer anyone. We want trade, cooperation, and peace. But I want to be very clear about something because clarity is kinder than confusion. She looked around the hall slowly. If someone comes into our home with the intention of hurting us, we will not ask them to stop again. She sat back down. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then it became very loud again, but a different kind of loud, not the storm before impact sound from earlier. This was the sound of 200 species all trying to figure out how to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Kael'thar sat perfectly still in his seat. He looked at the woman who was less than half his height, who had no scales, no claws, no armor, who had walked into a room full of species who could physically crush her without effort, and had just told all of them, without raising her voice, that they had made an error in judgment. He thought about the protection offer he had made at the welcome ceremony. He thought about her smile. He understood the smile now. Severin leaned close to him and spoke quietly. "Ambassador, I filed a report about her the first night. I think I should have been clearer about what I saw." Kael'thar said nothing. He kept looking at Mara Voss. After the session ended and the delegates filed out, Veshkar of the Thraxi pulled his senior intelligence officer aside in a private corridor. "Find out everything," he said. "How many ships do they have? How many soldiers? What are their actual military capabilities? I want numbers." His intelligence officer went to work. 3 days later, he came back with a very short report. He had found partial numbers, estimates, fragments of data pulled from human communications and public announcements. He had assembled the best picture he could. When Veshkar read it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Is this real?" His officer said, "Our best estimate says yes." Veshkar set the report down. He looked out his window at the stars for a while. "Enough," he said quietly, repeating the single word the human military attaché had used when asked about their capabilities during a press inquiry after the session. Just that one word, delivered without emotion, without pride, without threat. "Enough." He began to wonder if the Thraxi Dominion's plan to build a coalition against humanity was something he still wanted to be part of. The deep mapping routes at the edge of known space were quiet places. Most species avoided them. The star density was low out there, the distances between systems were long, and there was very little worth trading for. Survey drones went through occasionally, but crewed ships were rare. Captain Jonas Rhee liked them for exactly those reasons. He was 38 years old, lean and dark-eyed, with a scar along his left jaw from an accident during his 3rd year in Earth's space program. He had been a fighter pilot before he was a captain, and before that he had grown up in a coastal city where the water was rough and the weather didn't ask permission before it changed. He had the kind of calm that comes from spending a lot of time in situations where panic is not useful. His ship, the Endurance Asterisk, was not a warship. It was a long-range exploration and mapping vessel, fast, lightly armed, built for distance rather than combat. It carried a crew of 11 and enough supplies for 14 months. Its mission was simple: go to the unmapped edge, record what was there, and come back. They were 6 months in when the signal arrived. It came through on a civilian emergency frequency, the galactic standard distress call that all species used by agreement. It was faint, broken up by distance, but the computer cleaned it up in about 30 seconds and put the translation on screen. It was an Elhari colony vessel, the Asterisk Soft Branch. It had a crew of 43, including families, couples, children, elders. They had been traveling to a newly established Elhari agricultural colony 3 systems away when 2 Thraxi privateer ships had intercepted them. Privateers were the galaxy's polite word for pirates who had government backing and paperwork. The Asterisk Soft branch had no weapons. It had been boarded once already and robbed of its cargo. Now the Thraxi ships were holding position alongside it, and the signal was asking anyone in range for help. Read the signal. Then he looked at his navigation officer, a young woman named Priya, who was already pulling up the intercept route. "How far?" he said. "6 hours at full burn," she said. "Then let's go," he said. No debate, no discussion, no call back to Earth for authorization. They were too far out for a real-time link anyway. He just turned the ship and went. His crew knew what they were heading into. 2 Thraxi warships, each roughly 3 times the size of the Asterisk Endurance Asterisk, with full military armament and a crew that made a living doing violent things in places where no one could see. And on the other side, 1 unarmed colony ship full of people who could not defend themselves. The math was not in their favor. Ree spent the 6 hours doing what he always did when the math wasn't in his favor. He studied. He pulled up everything the Asterisk Endurance Asterisk S database had on Thraxi privateer tactics. He read engagement reports from other species. He looked at their standard attack formations, their communication protocols, their known weaknesses. He mapped the debris field that the navigation data showed was spread across that section of space, the remains of a dead star that had collapsed long ago, leaving a wide belt of rock and metal drifting in slow orbits. By the time they were 2 hours out, he had a plan. It wasn't a clean plan. Clean plans required resources he didn't have. It was the kind of plan that looked on paper like it might work if several things went right, if the Thraxi didn't react too quickly, and if the crew executed without hesitation. His crew was good at executing without hesitation. He gathered them and explained what they were going to do. There were no questions when he finished, just nods and people moving to their stations. The Endurance dropped out of its approach burn behind the largest dense cluster of debris in the field. They went dark, no active sensors, no emissions, engines running on minimum power. From the outside, they would look like a cold piece of rock drifting with the rest of the field. The Thraxi ships were exactly where the signal had placed them. They were sitting alongside the Asterisk Soft branch in a standard holding pattern, 1 ship on each side of the colony vessel. Textbook. Comfortable. They had done this many times before and nothing had ever gone wrong. Ree watched them on passive sensors for 40 minutes without moving. He was learning their rhythm, the small microburns they used to maintain position, the timing of their sensor sweeps, the frequency patterns of their communication bursts, the short routine updates that ships exchange when they're in a holding pattern. He fed all of it into the Asterisk Endurance Asterisk S communication system. Then he told his comms officer to broadcast a ghost signal. The Endurance Asterisk S communication hardware wasn't built for military electronic warfare, but it was built for long-range multi-frequency broadcasting. You needed that for deep space survey work. His comms officer used it now to generate fake fleet signatures on the Thraxi's primary detection frequency. Not just 1 signature, 4 large ones, coming in fast from 3 different directions, as if a human response fleet had been waiting in the area. It took the Thraxi 15 seconds to react. That was 15 seconds of confusion, of their attention snapping to the new signatures, of their sensors scrambling to confirm what they were seeing, of their captains beginning the calculation of whether to fight or run. Ree didn't give them long enough to finish the calculation. The Endurance came out of the debris field at an angle that put the first Thraxi ship between them and the second one, blocking any clear line of fire. They hit the first ship with everything they had, targeting the engine section. The Endurance had 3 weapon systems. None of them were powerful, But at close range, coming in from a direction the Thraxi weren't watching, it was enough to cripple the first ship's drives. Then Ree did something the Thraxi did not expect at all. He flew into the debris field. Not around it, through it, at speed, in a ship that was not designed for that kind of flying, through a field of rocks and metal chunks that could tear the hull open if he misjudged a single turn. The Thraxi's second ship followed him in, because the alternative was letting him escape to bring back a real fleet. Inside the debris field, the Thraxi ship's size became a disadvantage. It was built for open space. It had power and weapons, but it was not nimble. The endurance was smaller, and Ree had spent 40 minutes studying the debris layout on passive sensors. He knew where the gaps were. The Thraxi captain was flying blind. Ree led him through the field for 11 minutes, dodging, banking, using rocks as cover, drawing the larger ship further in. Then he cut his engines completely, let the Endurance drift behind a large, dense cluster, and went dark again. The Thraxi ship overshot him by 400 meters, trying to follow a target that had vanished. It took them 8 seconds to start turning around. Ree used those 8 seconds to come around the cluster at full engine power, closing the distance to point-blank range before they could bring weapons to bear, and finish the engagement at a distance where the size difference meant nothing at all. Both Thraxi ships were disabled and adrift within 22 minutes of the Asterisk Endurance arriving in the system. Ree docked with the Asterisk soft branch, confirmed the Elhari crew was physically safe, left the disabled Thraxi ships with a clear broadcast on emergency frequency so they could be recovered, and set a course for the nearest inhabited system. In his log that night, he wrote 3 sentences. Responded to distress call, threat neutralized, continuing mission. 6 weeks later, recovered sensor footage from the Thraxi ships made its way back to the Dominion's intelligence division. Veshkar's chief intelligence officer watched the full engagement 3 times before writing his analysis. The conclusion was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described what had happened technically. The second paragraph said something that Veshkar read 4 times slowly. This human did not follow any known tactical algorithm. He did not wait for orders or support. He improvised every element of the engagement in real time, using the environment as a weapon, psychological pressure as a tool, and apparent vulnerability as bait. He treated the engagement not as a military operation but as a hunt. He was patient, adaptive, and showed no sign of hesitation at any point. If this represents a standard level of individual human capability in the field, we strongly advise a reassessment of all current strategic assumptions regarding this species. Veshkar set the report down. He thought about the coalition he had been quietly building, the meetings, the promises, the plan to pressure humanity into accepting restrictions before they became too powerful to challenge. He called his senior aide and told him to cancel all the meetings. Then he sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about a small ship that had gone into a debris field after something 3 times its size. Not because it had to, not because it had backup coming, but simply because there were people who needed help and no one else was close enough. He was starting to think he had misunderstood humans completely. Not because they were more dangerous than he thought, but because they were something stranger than dangerous. 1 year. That was how long it had been since the human delegation walked into the Galactic Convergence Council's Great Hall and accepted a protection offer from a species that thought they were fragile. A lot had changed in 1 year. The Volkai Empire had formally apologized for the raid fleet incident, not warmly, and not without significant pressure from the Council, but the apology had been made and filed in the official record. Kelthar had been reassigned to a quieter post far from the Council. Severin had been promoted to senior diplomatic aide, partly because his early report about Mara Voss, even though it had been dismissed at the time, had shown better instincts than most of his colleagues. The Thraxi Dominion had withdrawn their proposal for an anti-human coalition without explanation. When asked why, Veshkar had said only that the original reasoning had been based on faulty assumptions. No one pressed him. Most of the species who had been privately approached about joining the coalition were, quietly, relieved. Earth had been reclassified. The new designation sat in the official galactic registry in clean, plain text, Class 1 Apex Species. It was a category that existed in the Council's historical records, but hadn't been assigned to a living species in recorded galactic history. The 3 other species who had ever held it were all gone, extinct, in each case, before modern interstellar civilization had fully formed. Humanity was the first living apex species anyone had ever actually had to deal with. The Council had spent a significant portion of the past year trying to figure out what that meant in practice. What they had found surprised almost everyone. In 12 months, Earth had sent medical aid packages to 4 different species who had experienced disasters. Human engineers had volunteered to help rebuild communication infrastructure on 2 Elhari colony worlds that the Thraxi privateers had damaged. A human university had published a research paper sharing a new water purification method and offered the technology freely to any species that needed it. 3 human trade vessels had established regular routes to smaller, less powerful worlds that the major empires had never considered worth the trip. The species that everyone had feared would be a problem were busy being useful. It confused a lot of people. A few species assumed it was strategy, that humans were building loyalty as a long-term political move. Some analysts wrote papers arguing it was a form of territorial behavior translated into economics. A Volkai commentator wrote a widely read piece arguing that humanity's helpfulness was simply another predator behavior, establishing control through dependency. Professor Zyravin read all of these analyses from her office at the Biology Institute. She had become, over the past year, the galaxy's leading expert on human biology and behavior, a title she hadn't asked for but had accepted because no one else was doing the work carefully enough. She had her own theory, and it was simpler than all the others. Humans helped because helping was something they had always done, not because it was safe or strategic or because they had calculated the return on investment. Their own history was full of examples of humans extending themselves for complete strangers, for species very different from themselves, for people they would never meet again. It was part of the same nature that made them relentless hunters, the same intensity, the same all-in commitment, just pointed in a different direction. They were not gentle because they were weak. They were not cooperative because they were afraid. They chose those things continuously because something in their deep nature understood, perhaps better than any other species in the galaxy, that survival was a group project. They had learned that lesson on Earth in the hardest way possible. She was finishing the last section of her final report on the day of Mara, Voss's formal address to the Council. It was the biggest session the Council had held since the emergency meeting a year ago. Every delegation was present. The hall was full. The air had the particular quality of a room where everyone is paying close attention and trying not to show it. Mara Voss walked to the speaker's position at the center of the hall. She looked as always very ordinary, small, calm, unhurried. She was wearing the same style of dark uniform she had worn on the first day. She carried no notes. She looked around the hall for a moment at the hundreds of different faces, different body shapes, different eyes looking back at her. Then she began to speak. 1 year ago I sat in this hall and listened to a very kind offer to protect us, she said. I know now that the offer was made because we looked like something that needed protecting. I'm not angry about that, I understand it. From the outside, humans probably do look that way. She paused. We are small, our skin is soft. We don't have claws or armor or poison. We live short lives compared to many of you. We get sick easily. We get cold easily. We get hurt easily. The hall was completely quiet. But I want to tell you something about where we come from, she continued. Our planet tried to kill us for 250,000 years. Ice ages, droughts, earthquakes, floods, diseases, predators that were bigger and faster and stronger than anything we could match physically. Our species has been almost completely wiped out at least once that we know of, reduced to so few people that any reasonable outside observer would have called us finished. She let that sit for a moment. We came back, every time, not because we were the strongest thing on Earth. We weren't. Not because we were the fastest. We weren't. We came back because we are very, very difficult to make give up. And because we learned early that the only way to survive a world that was trying to kill us was to take care of each other. She looked around the room again. Every predator on our world eventually learned to live alongside others, or it went extinct. The ones that only took, only competed, only dominated, they're gone now. We studied their bones. We know what that road looks like at the end. She paused. We are the only species on our planet that looked at that choice and chose cooperation before we had to, before we were forced, when we were still strong enough to just take what we wanted. She put her hands flat on the surface in front of her. That is not weakness. That is the hardest thing an apex predator can do, and we want to do it here with all of you if you'll let us. When she finished speaking and returned to her seat, the hall was silent for a long moment. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that comes after something that needs a moment to settle. Then Zyravan stood up. She was not scheduled to speak. She was present only as a scientific observer. Technically, she was not supposed to address the full council from the floor. She stood up anyway. The chief speaker looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Zyravan spoke without notes, because she had been thinking about this for a year and she knew the words. I am a biologist, she said. I have spent my career studying life, how it grows, how it survives, how it changes. I have studied more than 300 species. I have never, in 40 years of work, written a report like the one I submitted about humans. She looked around the hall. Humans are not the most armored species in the known galaxy. They are not the fastest. They are not the largest. They do not live the longest. They have no natural weapons that would concern most of the species in this room. She paused. They are simply the species that refused across every era, every extinction event, every ice age and disease and catastrophe their world threw at them, to ever, even once, consider themselves prey. She let the silence hold for a moment before she finished. And that, more than any claw or weapon or warship, is what makes them the most remarkable thing I have ever studied. She sat back down. The vote to formally welcome humanity into full membership of the Galactic Convergence Council passed without a single dissenting voice. Not the protected status they had been offered on the first day. Not a conditional membership with restrictions and oversight. Full membership. Equal standing. The first apex predator in galactic history, to earn its seat through chosen restraint as much as demonstrated strength. After the session ended and the hall began to empty, Kael'thar's replacement as Vo'kai ambassador, a younger diplomat who had been a child when humans first made contact, walked over to where Mara Voss was gathering her things. Ambassador, he said, a little carefully. I want to say, on behalf of my delegation, that the events of last year were not representative of how the Vo'kai hope to engage with humanity going forward. Mara Voss looked at him. Then she smiled, the same quiet, easy smile she had been using since the first day, the one that had taken the galaxy a full year to start understanding. I know, she said, we're good. She walked out of the hall at the same unhurried pace she always used. Far across the galaxy on the edge of mapped space, the Endurance was picking up a new signal. Not a distress call this time. Something else. A faint, strange transmission coming from a region that no survey drone had ever mapped, from a direction no ship had ever traveled. Captain Jonas read the signal data on his screen. His navigator was already looking at him with a question on her face. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Plot a course," he said. And the ship turned toward the unknown, the way it always had, the way it always would. Humans had always been most comfortable at the frontier.